To see more of my work, or to help support what I'm doing on this channel, check out the Patreon or my website links in the description of this video. In the comments section of my last video, I asked you for your suggestions for what sort of tutorials you'd like to see me cover next. The answer was overwhelmingly a start-to-finish pendant tutorial. And while this is definitely something that's on my radar and I plan to do in the future, for now, I want to focus on smaller techniques that we can use to fill in each piece. For this video, I want to cover 3 weaving and coil techniques that I use in almost every piece that I build coil structures for. These 3 techniques are really easy to combine together to create a really cool and unique flow to your pieces. Let's start with the ladder weave section. I have 2 pieces of 21 gauge square and 1 piece of 30 gauge round. About 4 inches for the square and about 3 feet with the round. You can play around with these sizes and these lengths to find what's most comfortable for you. To start the coil, I'm going to wrap once or twice around one of the squares with my 30 gauge. Slide it down to about a ½ inch from the end. From here, I'm going to clamp them parallel to each other in this little clamp. This pattern is really simple, and it adds a really cool texture to your finished pieces. To start it, I'm going to take that same wire and wrap it around 3 full rotations. Slide everything down with my fingernail to make sure it sits nice and flush. Then going back to my starting wire that has the coil at the bottom, I'm going to add 5 times. And then I'm going to go back to 3 around both. And then 5 around. You can kind of see that ladder pattern beginning to take shape. Keeping careful count between the number of coils around the single versus the double will help you establish a nice uniform pattern. Once you have the structure as long as you prefer, I like to take my nylon tipped pliers and just flatten those coils and make sure that it sits nice and uniform and flat. Let's go ahead and move on to the tapered weave. For this, again, I have 2 21 squares, about 4 inches long, and I have about 1.5 feet of 28 gauge round. I'm going to start it the same way, wrapping it around once or twice, and then clamping the 2 parallel together. Wrapping it around the single wire first means that I can go back and snip off that little spur, and the end of the wire will be safely tucked between the 2 pieces. That way it won't unravel. To start this one, I'm going to go ahead and just wrap around both squares maybe about 30 times. Now that we have a nice coil to start from, I'm going to use my nylon tips. Flatten that out, and then just barely, trying to keep these as straight as possible, I want to run my thumbs between them to gently taper them apart. I'm going to go ahead and wrap around 5 more times. Perfect. That extra little bit of taper gives us just enough space to smoothly transition from the coil into the weave. To start the weave, I'm going to take my round wire over the square on the left and then down underneath the square on the right. Back to the middle and then back out to the right. And then switch up in between both squares and around again on the other side. Back, down in between, around again on the other side. I'm going to repeat that same pattern for the extent that I want the weave. Once I reach the desired length, I can take my nylon tips and flatten that weave, making sure it's nice and uniform. Last but not least, I have 2 pieces of 21 gauge square and about 1.5 foot of 28 gauge round. I'm going to start this the same way as the other 2, wrapping around my square and putting them parallel in the clamp. Now with this one, I want it to taper gently towards this blue side. I've marked the blue wire on both sides with Sharpie. Now, even though I want it to curve that direction, in order to make sure that the weave is uniform, I want these to be about parallel when I start, not curved from the beginning. To curve the weave, we use pretty much the same process, going down in between both squares, wrapping once around the blue wire, going back in between, but this time I want to wrap twice around the silver wire before going back in between. Then once more around the blue, back to the middle, and then twice on the silver. I'm going to repeat that same process until I have about the desired length for the weave. Once around the blue, back to the center, twice around the silver. Once you reach the desired length for the weave, go ahead and clamp it with the nylon just to flatten everything out. Then we can go ahead and give it that curve. Gently pressing it together so the weave compresses, bending together with my fingertips. Just enough until you see the inside coil condensed so there's no space exposing the square wire in between. And there we go, we have 2 parallel running coils, it looks like. No spacing in between where you can see the square. That's really the goal with this technique. These 3 techniques can be combined to some really cool and interesting effects. As always, let me know what you think about this video in the comments. I really value your feedback, and I want to know what I can do to make sure that these videos are as helpful as possible. If you found this video helpful, go ahead and subscribe to my channel for more content similar in the future.